With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, this is going to be fun. Not because of the subject matter, which is serious and deep, but because of who's talking about it. A new guest, which is always fun to have on the show, a fresh face, if you will, another of our great Young Voices contributors, Leslie Corbly, joining us from out. She's in Utah, but she migrated over to the East Coast temporarily. How are you, ma'am? Thank you for joining us.
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you being on the East Coast, so don't have to worry about the time change, because that's the first thing I was worried about. Because I lived in Vegas and I still can't figure it out. Let's talk a little bit about warrants. You've been writing about them. Let's start big picture, and then we'll dig down on this. Do we just need a different definition of warrant? Because I think it's too big a term, it's too inclusive, and as we're rapidly finding out, and as you've been writing about in places like Town Hall and elsewhere, we've got situations that the current laws on the books for warrants just never even envisioned when it comes to things like the geofencing, things like what is and isn't private information. Do you own your own name, as we're seeing in things like college sports? I think the term warrant, we're going to need some different nomenclature somewhere in here just to get into this issue to start with, aren't we?
Well, part of the problem really is that the Constitution has a specific definition of warrant, and I believe geofences, for example, are constitute general warrants. So there's a lack of particularity there. There's no suspect, for instance, on the front end of those. When those warrants are issued, they are essentially fishing expeditions where law enforcement is seeking a cache of data for the purpose of identifying a suspect rather than having a suspect in mind and issuing a warrant on the that's specific to that individual. So there's that issue, which I would argue is outside of the realm of constitutional definition of a warrant. I think I would call that a general warrant, which is actually what the Fourth Amendment was designed to protect against. And then you do also have the problem of scope of warrants in a digital context, which is really what I was trying to touch on in that article. There's a lot of confusion about warrants out in the public right now, given some of the news stories coming out. I think some of that comes down, frankly, to ignorance on the part of the media. There's often conflating terms, not being specific as to what you're discussing. And then, of course, there is the fact that constitutional jurisprudence as it relates to the Fourth Amendment has evolved quite a bit over the past 50 or so years. And so you have that kind of confusing factor as well. But as it relates to the digital warrant problem, the scope of warrants in a digital context is that you don't have a physical space. And I tried to touch on that in the article, that in a physical space, you're to some degree bound by that, right? You walk into a home, you kind of know what the different rooms are for. If you're, I can't remember the exact example I gave in the article off the top of my head, but essentially if you're looking for a bike, you wouldn't look in a stolen bike, you wouldn't look in a desk drawer, right? I mean, you're kind of bound by that. In a digital context, you really don't have any of those typical barriers. And so, no, if you're law enforcement executing the warrant, it's almost as if you're going to kind of be more inclusive, right? You're going to pull more information maybe than in other contexts because it's all information, right? So it's almost more akin to classic warrants where you would be looking for, let's just hypothetically say child pornography, where that could be stored almost anywhere in a home, right?
And this is getting into, because the physical entrances into the digital is part of the problem. You talk about the Eastman cell phone being seized. We saw the news story about the congressman from Pennsylvania getting his cell phone seized. The problem is a cell phone's not like a house where you can, like you said, you're using the example in the article, you have a rifle that's not in a kitchen drawer, okay, because it physically can't get in there. You can, and we even saw it with like the Trump search warrant where they're supposed to go to certain rooms and there's this room and you can't go in this room and whatever, and people can hash that out later. You can't do that with a phone. You can't do that with a laptop. You can't do that with a thumb drive. So when you take somebody's cell phone, I guess theoretically you could say, well, you're not allowed to look in you can look in their photos, but you can't look in their download folder. I guess theoretically you can do that, but practically that's not the same thing. So the laws just haven't caught up to this stuff. Isn't that kind of the core of the problem we go in this? Is like there's still those physical barriers, but the information isn't physical.
Yes, I mean it's really difficult to apply even the best principles of law to this kind of a problem, because you run into situations where you look at a phone, for instance, and they're not organized the same. You take my phone and you see how my apps are arranged, and you look at your phone and you're not going to have the same nomenclature for how the apps are organized. And so if you're law enforcement and you have, like, let's say that you have probable cause, you follow proper warrant protocols, and then you go to seize that device, how are you going to know to sort through what is and isn't relevant to your investigation, right? So it almost is as if you kind of have to be over inclusive. It's not particularly easy to figure this out, which is why you see it appears as though we're moving towards having someone to review that, right? So in the case of Eastman, you're going to have potentially attorney-client privileged information on the device, and that again poses more problems because phones are multifunctional, right? They don't just store a lot of information, but they store a lot of information that is for a bunch of disparate purposes, right? So that also lends itself to kind of the problem that we're running into, which is that you're not going to have just one purpose for that device. Therefore, when it sees, you're going to, again, have far more information than you need. And in many situations, a lot of information that you shouldn't have or has nothing to do with the investigation.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Right, and it's not just that the information's different; the investigations are different. So you go back a couple of years when this first kind of got in the news cycle, the mass shooting in California, and they wanted to get into the iPhone, and Apple resisted that, and it went to court and all that. So that's one piece, and then you have something like the Eastman thing, where you have, there was some kind of shenanigans. You can parse that out legally later, however you want to do it. So they want to see what's there. Well, you've got the information, but there is attorney-client privilege, and there is personal information, so it gets complicated. The investigations aren't the same either. So now, we have a lot of lawyers on this program to explain this stuff. They don't even agree on this stuff. We know there's malfeasance. We know that things get abused. We know that people's individual rights get trampled. But isn't it fair to, as a starting point, to go, even if law enforcement is really, really trying, in this environment with the current laws, they don't even have a chance to try to do it the right way. And that's going to foster an environment for even more malfeasance, isn't it, if they don't get a handle on this?
Yes, that's exactly my concern, is that these are very complicated problems that we're facing in the judicial context, as far as not only as I mentioned earlier, is a warrant valid? Have we met particularity? Are we perhaps out of bounds with that? But also, again, just that digital scope. The digital world presents very different problems than the physical world, and it's not remotely clear how to solve those problems. We've talked about some of them, that you enter a device, you don't have a similar nomenclature. Where things are organized is going to be different. Law enforcement, again, even if they're doing their best, certainly can't trust the individual that they're investigating. If, for instance, if you were to limit it, you can look at their emails, but not this other, folder, it would be very easy for people to just transfer information from A to B to skirt investigations, right? So you kind of have these inherent problems that come with the territory. I think it's going to be interesting to see. Obviously, in some contexts, you have taint teams that review these documents, but in a very polarized environment, I'm not convinced that, particularly in these high profile cases, that people are going to be particularly trusting of those who are engaged in the process. And that's very unfortunate, because given the problems we have, I think it is very, very important for our leaders to foster trust. And instead, we're most certainly right now seeing the opposite of that, right? Things are very polarized, very driven by politics, which I think is a problem in and of itself. Obviously, there's a lot of other problems that we could go down as far as, the entire, concern. A lot of people have concerns that there's, racial profiling. Others have concerns of political profiling. So it's just a highly polarized environment. And so these problems we're having that are very inherent to just where we're at technologically certainly do not help with sort of looking at the future and hoping for more clarity and uniformity in the way we handle these matters.
Is there any way to get to uniformity, though? I mean, what's the answer here? Because we're going to have people are going to want an overriding law on this tech stuff and legal stuff. I don't think you can do an overriding law. Are we doomed to failure by piecemeal advancement here? And that's a weird way to say it, but that feels like what's coming here. Is that the way it feels to you?
I think we need a two-pronged approach. I think the first thing people need to understand, in my view, I do think to some degree this is a consumer problem. I think we've sort of, as a culture, slow-walked into these issues by not really considering the potential costs of adopting very powerful technologies for multifunctional purposes without considering, again, the costs, right? That's not to say that we shouldn't have phones or anything like that, but it is, I think, something for people to consider of how they use their technology and how much information is stored where. I don't think these are considerations, for instance, that people have really been considering before some of these more very high profile scenarios occurred that kind of showed people what some problems look like, right? I would say probably 5 years ago, any of these warrant discussions would have been pretty obscure. And I think they're getting a lot more time in the limelight than they would have in other years past. So I think one thing certainly is for culture and individuals at an individual level of analysis to begin to consider how they want to use their devices, what they want different devices to be for, so on and so forth. And then as it relates to the legal side of things, I do think you're correct that one overarching law is not going to solve this problem. I think the judiciary is moving in the right direction, at least as far as it relates to having privacy rights and certain digital information. But as we all know, the judiciary moves notoriously slow. That's just how the process works. It's not a bad thing, by the way. I don't consider the speed of the judiciary to be a problem per se. You don't necessarily want your justice system at the judicial level to be moving too quickly. That can also pose problems. So I do think the judiciary has been showing signs of going in the right direction on these issues. But as it relates specifically to the scope of warrants in the digital context, that is going to be I think, an area of difficulty for some time as we try to, as a society, work out what that looks like, because you're right that there's no overarching law that's going to solve that problem, because it really is a problem of the information being so easy to transition from point A to point B in a digital context, right? That limiting where law enforcement can look once they have probable cause to seize the device itself becomes very difficult to say you can't look in this folder, right? And then there's also the issue of cloud. So for instance, when you get into a device, can you only look at what is locally stored on that device, or can you look at anything that is uploaded to the cloud? So those are other concerns that kind of a limitation I do think is more I would say is more likely to occur than others. Once something is locally stored on the device, I don't see what's going to limit law enforcement from looking at that. But as it relates to the cloud, you could potentially have a requirement for a separate warrant, right, to view what's in the cloud.
Yeah, Leslie Corbly joining us. We're going to take a quick break. We come back. We're going to talk some of the details of that. That's the legal side of it. We get back. We're going to talk the political side of it, the practical side of it. At some point, you're going to have to put legislation to pen and ink. It's got to be in black and white. What's that got to look like? What should it look like? What are we afraid it might look like? We're going to get into all that. Leslie Corbly joining us on Heard Tell right after this. Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Leslie Corbly joining us. We have been talking about warrants, not the 80s band, the things that the police can use to come and look through your stuff. There's some legal things involved in that you might have heard of. Folks aren't real sure where all the lines are that. We talked about the legal aspect. Let's talk about the political and the practical aspect for a second, because here's the problem. Anytime the technology or current events outruns the law, you've got to have new laws. Well, we know the court system is acting on this because they have to, because you go to court, both law enforcement and private citizens and advocacy groups, they're all using through the court system. That's one side of this. What's supposed to happen in the American system of governments is we go to our legislatures and we make laws about such things. I'm not super enthusiastic that we're going to get good laws on this stuff anytime soon, because A, I've listened to some of these tech hearings. They have no idea what they're talking about. B, like you said, this is really complicated stuff. And we have a divided legislative branch right now that's got other priorities. Is there anything on the horizon legislatively that might be looking to address this problem anytime soon?
So one of the encouraging signs that we can point to is looking at states. So here in the state, well, here as in I work for the Libertas Institute, which is located in Lehi, Utah. Right now, as you mentioned, I am temporarily on the East Coast, but we have worked to pass laws in Utah that protect individual privacy rights, particularly as it relates to Fourth Amendment concerns. So that includes requiring a warrant before electronic information can be seized. And then we are also currently really working on the issue of geofencing, wanting to ensure that general warrants are barred here in the 21st century, just as they were back at the founding of America, right? So I think that there are some encouraging signs. My hope is at the state level, you're likely to see more movement than at the federal, which is unfortunate. But as you mentioned, the federal Congress is very divided. Very few laws get through Congress that aren't heavily full of pork kind of special interest groups that have gotten together and kind of poured everything in the kitchen sink into the bill. So it is very difficult to get movement at the federal level.
Well, if we can't get the federal level, what about the state level? Is there any movement now? Now this is going to get complicated because they're going to go to court and try to get the federals anything they don't like at the state level. But these are supposed to be the laboratories of democracy. What at the state level? Because some of these states are actually taking some initiative on some of these issues. Is that going to be a route to we can at least start getting some stuff moving, and then maybe that'll kickstart the federal level?
Sure. Some of the part of the problem here is that there are multiple concerns going on with privacy. So, for instance, there's, like we mentioned, geofence. There's the digital scope of warrant, and then there's also things like genetic digital privacy is becoming a problem. So, anywhere that you have a large database of information, you could think of as sort of posing a risk. So, again, in Utah, we have barred we've ensured that we have a law in the books ensuring that there is a warrant requirement prior to law enforcement seeking to obtain, any kind of electronic information from an electronic device. So that is a good movement in the right direction. I know that Maryland passed a genetic privacy bill. So that is related to DNA and how you would obtain that. And several other states are making movement on privacy. I know Montana, for instance, is looking heavily at the facial recognition issue. So these issues are both ongoing, and that the risks don't just relate to one type of information. And so it's going to be an ongoing process to attempt to ensure that individuals maintain their privacy rights in the 21st century. I do think there's more movement, though, at the state level than there is at federal. Again, both for obvious reasons that federal is very polarized, and also federal action is just very uncommon now. You don't have the same, if you look at the patterns of legislation, you don't have the same type of lawmaking now that you did, say, in like 1970.
Well, because we don't have the technology in 1970, we don't have the government we had in 1970. Let's be real clear about that. We don't have the same culture and people we had in 1970. The other problem we have when you go to legislate this stuff, and we're seeing this in the tech hearings already, where they're talking about, well, we need to regulate Facebook, and we need to regulate, we've had the court cases now where Alexa overhears crimes and things like this. The problem is, they're talking about regulating Facebook. None of my kids do Facebook. Facebook is 2 technologies ago already. By the time they get around to regulating this stuff, we're already onto the new things. Isn't that going to be a problem with some of this technology with the warrants? Is by the time Congress dithers around for 5 or 10 years and writes a bill on something, we're already on to the next thing, and it's just passes by again. Now, I know that's a recurring thing. You're never always going to have legislation catching up all the time. But when it comes to something like warrants, where the armed enforcement wing of the government can come into your home or come into your private property or come into your life and really wreak some havoc, this is a big problem with a lot. And we've seen, unfortunately, societally, this has immediate ramifications. This isn't just, talking about tax code where you might pay a little extra sometime next year. People can get hurt. People can lose their property. People can have their lives wrecked. I'm a little frustrated that there ain't a sense of urgency about this issue. Do you see any sense of urgency about it? Because there needs to be.
I think that the lack of sense of urgency often relates to the fact that it's not a simple, easy soundbite type of an issue, right? Where you can get kind of an easy political win, so to speak, which is unfortunate. As far as something that I think would be helpful for your listeners to know, though, there's no requirement, like you mentioned, regulating Facebook. There's no requirement for individuals to work with social media companies or other tech and communications companies that they don't trust. And I do think we need to encourage individuals to be much more cautious with whom they do business in our current era, right? If law enforcement, for instance, goes to hypothetically Snapchat, and you've never had a Snapchat account, there's nothing for them to hand over, right? And so that relates to the third-party doctrine. I know we've kind of moved into the political discussion rather than legal, but the third-party doctrine makes it much easier for law enforcement to access information from entities like tech companies that individuals have given information over to them. So essentially, the third-party doctrine says that once you've handed over some information to a third-party entity, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that information, and therefore, it's easier for law enforcement to obtain. And so that's one of the reasons, for instance, in Utah, that we passed a bill requiring a warrant before obtaining electronic information, because obviously in the digital age, pretty much everything is done through a third party, right? It's not like 1960s and 70s when some of these lines of cases came out where, very a much smaller amount of information was handed over to a third party, right? So again, that relates, I know, to the legal, but it is important for people to understand that, because if you know that, I think it makes it easier for you as an individual to say, I know I would really like to know, company, what your policies are. For instance, what data do you obtain on me? Like what what data do you first gather? Because if, for instance, with geofences, if Google didn't gather your location data, they wouldn't have that to hand over to law enforcement. Now, obviously they do, but the point is for individuals to know it is within their power to ask these questions before they contract. Okay, I kind of want to know what data you collect. How do you just store it? How long do you store different data points, right? So that you can kind of assess your individual risk, because I don't think a lot of people are thinking of this as a risk calculation, but it really is, because the reality of the situation is that once you are engaging in any kind of conduct on these platforms, you don't really necessarily have control over where that information goes.
Yeah, and the risk calculation, the reason the risk calculation is all screwed up is because people don't understand their rights. And you ended your piece with this, and this is a good way to kind of dovetail this down a little bit. Law enforcement doesn't know the boundaries on this. Individual people don't know the boundaries on this. Companies don't know the boundaries on this. Everybody's uncertain. And as you said in your piece, everybody, law enforcement, defendants alike, are swimming in a sea of uncertainty. That's a recipe for disaster. When we're talking culture and politics, we want to talk about, the policies and whatever the hottest thing going on that is going, and the horse race politics and the culture politics. This is stuff that can affect your everyday life, because the part of the government the most people interact with is not a politician, it's law enforcement. This is the stuff we should really be focusing on. And like you said, when there's uncertainty, that breeds all kinds of bad things happening. And we've seen the viral videos of what happens when law enforcement doesn't know what to do with certain defendants. How do we get certainty in this? Is it going to be a policy fix? Is it going to be a cultural fix where people just start taking their own responsibility for their data? Is it a technology fix where they figure out a better way to individualize, for lack of a better term? But when it comes to privacy, that's what the argument is. What's the path forward, do you think? And I know it's going to be a ratio of some of those combined, but give us a couple of things you think of.
I definitely think it's going to be a combination. I think at the individual level, we really need to start. I think there needs to be good messaging, and it's something I will be working on, is to ensure that people understand the risks associated with different data points, right? So let's take a geofence warrant, for instance, where it's a reverse warrant, meaning they're seeking caches of data that has already been collected by a tech company. There's been the first litigation case initiated in relation to keyword search history, which can operate in the same manner. Tech company hand over all searches from, of certain terms, or certain terms combined. It could look differently depending on what law enforcement's asking for. But the point being that initially law enforcement obtains anonymized data in relation to these requests, and then eventually it moves to an unmasking process. So I do think individuals need to understand that, not to be overly concerned of law enforcement, but to understand that if you're operating in society now, you don't necessarily have control over company policies, over how easy it is for law enforcement to access data from company X, so you want to know, am I willing to take on this risk, right, of having this specific data point collected and stored, right? So for instance, there was a recent CNN article that discussed how wireless companies also store location data for months and at times years. So there's all these data points out there, and they're stored in these large databases. So I think that there's an individual aspect that can push the needle in the right direction. I think that also, by the way, can relate hopefully to the marketplace, in the sense that companies that value privacy and value data minimization, which essentially means minimizing the number of data sets you collect information on, and therefore there's less information for you to ever hand over, hypothetically, right? I think that individuals valuing their privacy and saying, I'm not sure I want to work with companies that collect data in certain ways, so on and so forth, can push the marketplace towards towards favorability for companies who do truly value privacy and are able to deliver that to consumers. So I think that's piece of the puzzle. I think policy is also a piece of that puzzle. For instance, the work we've done in Utah to ensure warrant requirements are strong for electronic data is important. And we do think that the law needs to change in relation to geofence warrants and other reverse warrants where law enforcement is seeking information that, again, these caches of data, and the whole point is to find a suspect. You don't have a suspect on the front end when you do a geofence warrant. The whole point is to get a cache of data, and then you sift through it for relevance, and it's generally a 3-step process that ends in unmasking. And I don't think that kind of a process is going to elicit a lot of trust from individuals right now. Again, you have a lot of people in different factions of American society that are very concerned with different types of biases that they believe are influencing individuals who in powerful positions, including law enforcement. And that's just the reality on the ground. And again, I do think it's very important for individuals to understand that they can have control over their risk profile, because it's going to be a both and approach of policy and culture. And I would also hope business practice comes into play.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of wishing and hoping, and we don't have a lot of faith that this is going to get better anytime soon. So we're going to keep talking to folks like Leslie about it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let folks know where they can keep up with you, what you've got going on, where they can follow you till we get you back on Heard Tell to keep talking about this, because this isn't going away. This is going to be the issue in privacy rights and law for the foreseeable future. So let folks know where they can keep up with you talking about it till we get you back to talk about it with us.
Sure. So I work with the Libertas Institute. I also have my own website. It's just my name, lesliecorbly.com. I host all of my articles there. It's a good hub just for my content. And then I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter for now. In the future, I will likely add some other platforms to that. But right now I'm on Twitter at Corbly Leslie, and also on LinkedIn. Folks can go in there and follow along, and I post all my content on those platforms.
Yep, we'll link to all of that. You can see her Twitter on the screen there if you're watching on the YouTube channels, and we greatly appreciate your time, Leslie Corbly. Love the talk, appreciate the information, and we will talk again real soon, my friend. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.